Hey guys, welcome back to this channel, The Voice of the Past. In this video, we will unfold the untold story of the Prescott family's unfinished business, a ghostly warning. Before continuing, if you are new into this channel, please consider subscribing to this channel. Let's start. The Prescott Manor had stood for over a century, perched on the edge of Blackwood Hollow. Time had weathered its grand Victorian architecture, yet it remained an imposing sight, a house whispered about in the village below. Tales of strange lights flickering in the windows at night, whispers carried by the wind, and the ghostly figure of a woman in white had cemented its eerie reputation. When Ethan Prescott returned to the manor after 20 years, he did so with skepticism. He had never believed in the family legends, dismissing them as nothing more than superstitions passed down by paranoid relatives. His father, Jonathan Prescott, had been the last to live in the house before vanishing without a trace. The property had remained abandoned ever since. Now, with his father legally declared dead, the manor belonged to him. Ethan had returned not out of sentiment, but necessity. The house needed to be sold, and he needed the money. Accompanied by his younger sister, Claire, and his fiancée, Rachel, he stepped through the creaking front doors, determined to put the past behind him. The air inside was stale, thick with dust and forgotten memories. Sunlight streamed through the tattered curtains, casting long shadows across the ornate wooden floors. The grand staircase loomed before them, leading up to the dimly lit second floor. "Feels colder than it should be," Claire murmured, rubbing her arms. Rachel shivered. "It's just an old house, Claire. Probably drafts coming through the cracks in the walls." Ethan nodded, though he couldn't shake an uneasy feeling creeping up his spine. "Let's just take a look around. If we're lucky, we can find some family heirlooms worth something before listing the place." They split up, Ethan heading toward the study, Claire exploring the sitting room, and Rachel cautiously making her way upstairs. The moment Ethan stepped into the study, a strange sensation washed over him. The room was exactly as their father had left it. Dusty books stacked haphazardly on the desk, a half-filled glass of whiskey still sitting on the shelf. He ran his fingers over the desk's surface, pausing when he noticed a single folded letter placed in the center. With trembling hands he unfolded it. "To my children, if you ever return to this house, leave immediately. There are things within these walls that should never be disturbed. The house does not belong to us alone." The words sent a chill down Ethan's spine. His father had always been a practical man. Why would he leave such a cryptic warning? A sudden crash from the sitting room shattered the silence. Ethan bolted toward the sound, finding Claire staring wide-eyed at the broken remains of a porcelain vase on the floor. "I didn't touch it," she whispered. "It just fell." Before Ethan could respond, a piercing scream echoed from upstairs. "Rachel!" They sprinted up the stairs, reaching the master bedroom just as Rachel stumbled backward, her face pale with terror. "There was someone in the mirror," she gasped. "She was watching me." Ethan turned toward the antique mirror hanging on the wall. His own reflection stared back at him, but something felt wrong. The shadows in the glass twisted and moved, as though something lurked just beyond the surface. And then, ever so faintly, the outline of a woman's face appeared, her hollow eyes locking onto his. The whisper that followed was barely audible, but it carried a chilling warning. "You should not have come back." Ethan stumbled back from the mirror, his breath caught in his throat as Rachel clung to his arm. Claire, her face pale, hovered near the doorway, unwilling to step inside. The woman's reflection had disappeared, but the icy grip of fear remained. Ethan forced himself to stay calm. "It's just an old mirror. Tricks of the light," he muttered, though his voice lacked conviction. Rachel shook her head. That wasn't a trick. She was there, watching. Claire crossed her arms, her voice barely above a whisper. You saw her too, Ethan. Don't pretend you didn't. A silence stretched between them before Ethan sighed and ran a hand through his hair. Look, we're all a little on edge. Let's just finish checking the house and get some rest. We'll deal with everything in the morning. Rachel hesitated, then nodded slowly. Claire, still skeptical but unwilling to argue, followed suit. They left the bedroom, but the unease followed them down the hallway. Dinner was a quiet affair. They had brought supplies for a few nights, but no one had much of an appetite. The dim candle light flickered against the walls of the dining room, casting shifting shadows that made Rachel glance over her shoulder every few minutes. Claire drummed her fingers against the table, staring at the ornate chandelier above them. This place is wrong, she said suddenly. It doesn't feel empty. It feels like it's waiting for something. Ethan set down his fork. It's just an old house, Claire. Our minds are playing tricks on us. Rachel, usually the most level-headed of them all, finally spoke. Then why did your father leave that letter? Ethan had no answer. Later that night, after setting up in the old bedrooms, Ethan found himself unable to sleep. The manor groaned with the weight of time, the wind howling through unseen cracks. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, his father's words looping in his mind. Something wasn't right here. The sound of soft footsteps outside his room made him sit up. He listened closely. The steps were slow, deliberate, pacing back and forth. "Claire?" he called, but there was no answer. He threw off the covers and moved toward the door, hesitating before pulling it open. The hallway stretched before him, empty except for the faint glow of moonlight streaming in through the windows. Then he saw her. At the far end of the corridor, a woman stood motionless. Her long white dress was tattered, her dark hair hanging over her face. Her head tilted slightly, as if listening, and then, without a sound, she turned and walked through the wall. Ethan's heart pounded. He blinked, but she was gone. He rushed down the hallway, placing his hand against the wall where she had vanished. Solid wood. No hidden door. Nothing. His pulse still racing, he made his way to Claire's room and knocked. When she answered, her eyes were already wide with fear. "You saw her too, didn't you?" she whispered. Ethan nodded, his throat dry. "We need to leave." They woke Rachel, who looked just as unsettled, and gathered their belongings as quickly as possible. The night air was crisp as they stepped onto the front porch, the car waiting at the bottom of the driveway. Ethan pulled out the keys, but the moment he stepped off the porch, the temperature plummeted. A thick fog rolled in from nowhere, swirling around their feet, creeping up the steps. The shadows beneath the trees stretched unnaturally, twisting and curling toward them. Rachel grabbed Ethan's arm. "We have to go. Now." They sprinted toward the car, but as Ethan reached for the door handle, the engine suddenly roared to life on its own. Headlights flashed blindingly before flickering and dying, leaving them in darkness. The doors locked with a loud click. Claire pulled at the handle, her breath coming fast. "It won't open." A whisper slithered through the night air, the same chilling voice they had heard in the mirror. "You cannot leave." And then the house, silent for so long, began to groan. The front door creaked open on its own, inviting them back inside. Something was keeping them here. Something that wasn't ready to let them go. Ethan's heart pounded as he yanked at the car door handle, but it refused to budge. Claire was still pulling at hers, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Rachel stood frozen, her eyes fixed on the looming silhouette of Prescott Manor behind them. The door had opened on its own, as if beckoning them back inside. Then, without warning, the fog thickened around their feet, curling like ghostly fingers, dragging toward them. The temperature plummeted further, their breath coming out in pale clouds against the night. Rachel grabbed Ethan's hand, her grip ice cold. "Ethan, we can't stay out here." Claire shook her head violently. "Are you insane? We can't go back inside. That's exactly what it wants." Ethan swallowed hard. They were trapped. They could either remain out in the freezing, unnatural mist or return to the manor and figure out what was happening. As much as he hated the idea, standing exposed in the open was not an option. With slow, reluctant steps, he turned toward the house. "We don't have a choice." Claire hesitated, then let out a shaky breath and followed. Rachel was the last to move, her shoulders stiff with tension. Together they crossed the threshold, stepping back into the house that refused to let them go. The moment the door shut behind them, the air inside shifted. It felt heavier, charged, as though the house itself had exhaled, satisfied with their return. The three of them exchanged glances, then moved deeper into the foyer. The chandeliers above flickered with dim, wavering light. The silence was thick, pressing against their ears like a force of its own. Ethan cleared his throat. "We need to figure out what's going on. If there's a way to break whatever this is." Rachel nodded slowly. "Your father's note. He knew something." Ethan reached into his pocket and pulled out the old, creased letter. The words felt even heavier now. "Leave immediately. There are things within these walls that should never be disturbed." Claire shivered. He knew something was wrong, but he stayed. Why? Ethan glanced toward the study where he had found the note. His father's workspace, untouched for decades, might hold more answers. Let's start in his office. They made their way down the hallway, the wooden floors creaking beneath their steps. The study door groaned as Ethan pushed it open. The dust in the air swirled under the dim glow of the lamp Rachel had switched on. Books lined the shelves, papers scattered across the desk as though Jonathan Prescott had left in a hurry. Claire moved toward an old cabinet, running her fingers over the carved wood. "It feels like he was looking for something." Ethan sat down at the desk and began sifting through the documents. Receipts, old letters, blueprints of the house, all mundane, all ordinary. But then, at the bottom of a stack, he found something that made his blood run cold. A journal. His father's handwriting scrawled across the cover. He hesitated only a moment before flipping it open, his eyes scanning the first few lines. There is something in this house. It watches. It waits. It does not like to be ignored. The words sent a chill through him. He turned the page, his father's frantic writing continuing. "I have heard the whispers. At first, I thought it was grief playing tricks on me after Margaret's death, but the whispers grew louder. Then the dreams began." Rachel leaned over his shoulder. "Who's Margaret?" Ethan frowned. "Our grandmother. She died in this house before we were born." Claire's fingers tightened around the edge of the cabinet. "You don't think she's the one haunting it, do you?" Ethan kept reading. "It is not Margaret. I thought it was at first, but I was wrong. This presence, it is much older, much darker. It is not one ghost, but many. They are trapped here. And soon, I fear I will be too." His hands trembled slightly as he turned the next page. "I found the source. The mirror in the master bedroom. It is not just a mirror. It is a door." Rachel gasped. "The mirror. That's where I saw her." Ethan felt the hairs on the back of his neck rise. He continued reading. "If anyone finds this, if my children return, do not look into the mirror for too long. Do not listen to the whispers. And above all, do not speak to her. She will try to trick you. She will try to bring you in. If she succeeds, you will never leave." The last few entries were frantic, almost illegible. Then, at the very bottom of the page, one final sentence stood alone. "She is coming for me." Ethan shut the journal, his hands clammy. Claire swallowed hard. We need to break it, Rachel nodded. If that mirror is a door, we need to find a way to close it. Forever. Ethan stood, his mind racing. If his father had found the source of the haunting, why hadn't he destroyed it? Had he tried? Had he failed? The answer, he realized with growing dread, might be upstairs, and it might be waiting for them. The three of them stood in heavy silence, the weight of their father's final words pressing down on them. The study suddenly felt colder, the walls seeming to close in. The knowledge that the mirror in the master bedroom was the heart of whatever haunted this house filled Ethan with a dread he couldn't shake. Claire broke the silence first. If that mirror is the source, we need to destroy it. Rachel nodded but glanced toward Ethan, waiting for his decision. He exhaled sharply, his hand still gripping the journal. Agreed. But we don't know what will happen when we do. Claire crossed her arms. Do we have another choice? They didn't. The house had made that clear. Slowly, they made their way back upstairs, each step creaking underfoot. The hallway felt darker now, the air thick and oppressive. The door to the master bedroom stood slightly ajar, and beyond it, the mirror loomed on the wall. The moment they stepped inside, the room felt different. It was colder than before, and the shadows near the mirror seemed to stretch unnaturally. Ethan's gaze locked onto the glass, his heart hammering against his ribs. She was there, the woman in white. She stood within the reflection, her hollow, sunken eyes staring at them with a quiet, knowing malice. The edges of her figure wavered, like smoke caught in a draft. Rachel grabbed Ethan's arm. We should... The whisper cut through the air, soft yet deafening. Stay. The door slammed shut behind them. Claire screamed, rushing for the handle, but no matter how hard she pulled, it wouldn't budge. Ethan turned back toward the mirror, his pulse spiking. The woman's expression twisted into something unnatural, her lips parting in a slow, ghastly smile. Rachel's breath hitched. She's watching us. Then the lights flickered. The room shifted. The furniture warped, twisting out of shape. The walls stretched as if something unseen was pressing against them from the other side. And then, the mirror began to ripple, the surface distorting like water, disturbed by an invisible hand. A deep, guttural voice, not the woman's, but something else, something darker, slithered from the glass. You cannot break what binds us. Ethan's breath came fast. We have to smash it, now. Claire frantically looked around. We need something heavy. Before she could finish, the room convulsed violently. The floor shook, the furniture toppling over. The mirror's glass darkened, shadows twisting behind it like writhing figures. The woman's face distorted, stretching unnaturally as she pressed her hands against the other side of the glass. Rachel grabbed a brass candlestick from the nightstand and threw it at the mirror. The moment it struck, the glass shuddered, sending ripples across its surface. But it didn't break. Claire grabbed a chair and hurled it forward. The wood splintered on impact, but the mirror remained intact, the distorted woman laughing soundlessly on the other side. Ethan clenched his fists. We need something stronger. And then he saw it. On the far side of the room, mounted above the fireplace, was an old iron poker. Without thinking, he rushed to grab it, the cold metal sending a sharp chill through his hands. He turned back to the mirror, raising the poker above his head. The whisper returned, pleading this time. You don't understand. This house is ours. The room shook harder. The shadows lashed out from the mirror, long tendrils of darkness creeping across the floor. The moment they touched his foot, an ice-cold numbness spread up his leg. Rachel screamed, "Ethan, hurry!" He ignored the searing cold and swung the poker with all his strength. The impact sent a deafening crack through the air. The glass splintered, deep fractures spreading like spider webs across the surface. A shriek erupted from the mirror. Not just one voice, but many. Layers of agony and rage twisting together in an inhuman cry. The force of it sent them all stumbling backward. The shadows recoiled, writhing violently as though in pain. The glass continued to crack, deeper and deeper. And then it shattered. The room exploded into chaos. A violent gust of wind surged outward from the mirror, sending papers, furniture, and dust flying. The walls trembled, the entire house groaning as though in protest. The lights flickered wildly before bursting, plunging them into near darkness. Through the howling wind, the whispers rose again, overlapping in desperate, frenzied voices. "No, no, you cannot free them." Ethan shielded his face as the shards of the mirror pulsed with an eerie blue glow before disintegrating into nothing. The wind died abruptly, the house falling into absolute silence. For a long moment, none of them moved. Rachel was the first to speak, her voice barely above a whisper. "Is it over?" Ethan's breathing was uneven, his heart still hammering. He looked around. The room was still. The mirror was gone. The air, once so heavy and oppressive, now felt lighter. Claire exhaled shakily and sagged against the wall. "Did we actually—" A sudden noise from the hallway made them all freeze. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, growing closer. Ethan turned sharply, his stomach twisting. The door creaked open on its own, revealing the dimly lit hallway beyond. And there, standing just outside the room, was a man. His father, Jonathan Prescott. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. "Dad?" The man's form was hazy, almost transparent, but his eyes, filled with sadness and relief, were unmistakable. He looked at them all, then at the shattered remains of where the mirror had been. His voice, barely above a whisper, carried through the still air. "You set us free." Ethan's throat tightened. "Dad, we looked for you. We thought—" Jonathan shook his head. "I was never truly gone, not while the mirror held me." He glanced at Rachel and Claire. "You all were never meant to suffer here. I tried to warn you, but she—" His gaze darkened. "She wouldn't let me." Claire wiped at her eyes. "It wasn't just her, was it? There were others. Dozens of them." Jonathan nodded solemnly. "Spirits bound to this house for generations. Some didn't even remember their names anymore. But now, they're free." The weight in the air had lifted. The house, though still old and broken, no longer felt alive with unseen eyes. Rachel swallowed. "Are you free too?" Jonathan gave Ethan a long look. "I believe so." His form began to fade, dissolving into mist, but before he disappeared entirely, he gave them a small, bittersweet smile. "Thank you." And then he was gone. The three of them stood there for a long time, letting the silence settle around them. The house was just a house now, empty, silent. Ethan took a deep breath. "Let's get out of here." Without another word, they left the master bedroom, descended the stairs, and stepped out into the night. The air was warmer. The fog had lifted. The car unlocked effortlessly this time. As they drove away from Prescott Manor for the last time, none of them looked back, and behind them, the house stood quiet. For the first time in over a century, it was finally at peace. The road stretched before them, winding away from Prescott Manor. The silence in the car was thick, none of them speaking as they left the house behind. Ethan kept his eyes on the road, his grip tight on the steering wheel. Rachel sat in the passenger seat, her gaze fixed on the side mirror, as if expecting to see something, someone watching them. Claire sat in the back, her arms wrapped around herself, staring blankly ahead. No one dared to say it out loud, but the same question hung in the air. Was it really over? The last words of their father echoed in Ethan's mind. You set us free. He wanted to believe it. He had to believe it. But a part of him still felt the weight of the house, the history it carried. Could something like that ever truly be put to rest? Rachel finally broke the silence. Where do we go now? Ethan exhaled, forcing himself to focus. We'll check into a motel for the night. We can figure everything else out in the morning. Claire's voice was quiet, distant. And then what? Ethan didn't have an answer. Selling the house had been the original plan, but after what they had just experienced, he doubted anyone would ever live there again. The idea of simply walking away felt both like a relief and a betrayal. Their family's past, the spirits trapped there, it was all tied to that place. Rachel glanced at him. You're not thinking of going back, are you? No, Ethan said quickly, but the hesitation in his voice made Claire sit up straighter. Ethan? I said no, he repeated more firmly this time. It's done. We did what we came to do. Claire studied him for a moment before leaning back in her seat. Good. The rest of the drive passed in silence. The town was small and finding a motel wasn't difficult. Ethan checked them in and they shuffled to their rooms, exhausted beyond words. As Ethan lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, his mind wouldn't quiet. The image of his father lingered, the sadness in his eyes. He had been trapped for so long. How many others had suffered the same fate? And for what? A thought nagged at the back of his mind. Something unfinished. Something left unsaid. Eventually, exhaustion won. His eyes drifted shut, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he slept without dreams. But somewhere in the distance, far beyond the quiet of the motel, the Prescott Manor stood alone in the night, waiting. The morning light streamed through the motel curtains, casting long shadows across the floor. Ethan sat on the edge of the bed, rubbing his eyes as the events of the previous night slowly settled in. It felt surreal, like something out of a nightmare, but the ache in his body and the exhaustion in his bones told him otherwise. Claire was already awake when he stepped outside. She sat on the curb, her arms wrapped around her knees, staring at nothing in particular. You okay? Ethan asked as he sat down beside her. She nodded, but there was hesitation in her voice. Yeah, I just can't believe it's actually over. Ethan glanced toward the sky, feeling the weight of her words. Me neither. Rachel soon joined them, handing them each a cup of coffee. She looked better than the night before, but there was still a lingering unease in her eyes. So, what now? Ethan exhaled. We move on. We don't talk about it. We don't go back. We just move on. Claire nodded slowly. That's probably for the best. There was nothing left to say. By noon, they were on the road again, heading away from Blackwood Hollow, away from the house that had bound their family in ways they never understood. Ethan knew they would never fully escape what had happened, but for the first time in his life, he felt like the shadow of the Prescott legacy had lifted. The house was just a house now. The spirits were free. Their father was free. And so were they. As they disappeared down the highway, Prescott Manor stood empty, its walls silent. The ghosts that had lingered there for generations were gone. The whispers had faded. The doors no longer creaked with unseen presence. For the first time in over a century, the house finally rested, and it would stay that way, forever. Thanks for watching. If you want to see more stories like this, hit that like button and don't forget to hit that subscribe button. And let me know on which topic you would like to see stories next. And check out these other stories you might enjoy. See you in the next one. Till then, take care and goodbye.